be with you. Usually, my wife and I and our little daughters sit somewhere right up here. So now I get to see all of you at once. Usually we just get to see the front row here. I have a question, though, before we really get into our topic today, or actually as part of the topic, and this is no rhetorical question, is, are you alive? Yeah, it sounds like it's barely, because I didn't. Are you alive? Are you really alive? Yeah, somebody is really alive. Could you just make sure, check with your neighbor or with yourself for just a second, whatever you need to do to make sure that you are really alive and that you're not in some dream. So just check, just for a second, whether you're really alive and not in some dream, some matrix kind of thing. Okay, so you're sure you're alive, right? How did you find out? Yes, that's one of those things I was waiting for, the pinching thing, right? I think that part of the answer to this depends on what major you're going to take. Some of you are going into biology and you say, well, I felt my heartbeat. I know I'm alive. Some of you are going to be ongoing neurosurgeons, and I have brain activity going on. I'm alive. Maybe some of you are music majors. I hear something. I must be alive. Photography majors, graphic arts. If you see the world around you, you must be alive. The psychologists and counselors among you will say, well, if you feel, you're alive. If you have feelings, life. And those of you most of us just pinched ourselves or hurt ourselves enough that we felt the prick but not have lasting damage, right? Kind of the thing, we know that we're alive. Life. Now that we're alive, how do we know what a good life is, though? What qualifies a good life? How do we find that out? How is your life like? You'd probably say right now, my life is busy. It's kind of everybody's answer. You have tests, exams, work schedules to fit in. Life is busy. A good life? A life worth living? That can't just be tests, exams, and work schedules. A life worth living. Not vegetating, but living. And probably some of you sitting here are wondering, is this a life worth living? Maybe because of some medical reason with you or your family, something that happened, makes you wonder, is it worth struggling and fighting through this cancer or this horrible sickness? Is it worth it? Some of you might be haunted by memories of the past. People that put you down, things that happened to you, abuse, life being sucked out of you. Maybe you wonder, is this a life worth living? Maybe some of you fear the future. What's going to happen after I get my degree? Maybe you're afraid of expectations of other people, of situations. Is it a life worth living? Then there might be some of you in this group that say, yes, life is worth living. Life is great at the moment. Santa Claus came in abundance this year. I have a good car. I'm going to a good school. Life is good. I'm enjoying it. I have the new iPhone and a good tablet. Life is good. Maybe some of you say, life is turning up. I got this eye on this particular somebody, and you're saying, there might be something, this budding romance. Life is looking up. Life is great. good friendships. Many reasons. And we come from different places. What is a good life? It can't just be defined by the individual moments of ups and downs that we have, can it? What makes life worth living? There are different answers that existentialists, people that think about these things, have given. One of them is, life is worth living if I live it for myself. For the moment, for the kick. We call this hedonism. If I can enjoy the moment, this is it. Get my fix, get my kick, the adrenaline rush. That's it. Others might say it's materialism. Santa baby.
Santa baby slipped a Rolex under the tree for me. I've been
And Michael Bublé will go on to not just want a Rolex, but a deed to a platinum mine and a 65 convertible in steel blue, by the way, and a lot of cha-ching. Materialism. Henry David Thoreau will say, to find life, you have to live it aesthetically. So he will say, I went to the woods because I wish to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I wanted to live deep and suck out the marrow of life. And so he goes into the woods, isolated from society and modern conveniences at the time, to find meaning in life in solitude. And then there's Paul. And he says, if you want to have a worthwhile life, you've got to die. Well, what a party pooper. Just when we're talking about life, he kills it. Literally. He kills it. Life is life when you're dead. And of all the other things that we've talked about before or mentioned, this is the one that is most peculiar. The one, this oxymoron of life and death. He'll actually go on in our chapter that we're looking at today to say, if you really want to be free, you've got to be a slave as well. Two oxymorons in chapter 6 of Romans. Because this is the most peculiar of all of them, let's unpack that a bit. Let's venture into what Paul has to say here. In Romans 6, in verse 11, he kind of sums up, he gives this first kind of thing. So you also should consider yourselves to be dead to the power of sin and alive to God through Jesus Christ. To understand chapter 6 and this question, chapter 6 begins with a peculiar question that we really can't understand if we don't remember what chapter 5 is all about. Chapter 5 is Paul's crazy and ludicrous claim that the cross is the center of history, this foolishness to everybody else. How can a dead man on a cross be the center of Earth's history? This unexplainable idea, this very unheroic event. I actually like that question. We like our superstars, right? Our Hollywood actors, our quick resolutions. By the way, the Asterix and Obelix cartoons are just about that. They always beat up the Romans. It's very simple. They get magic potion and they can just clobber them. Nobody ever dies. They're made for kids and and adults, I guess, as well. But we like our Hollywood superstars to come in, to beat up the bad guy, to get rid of the villain, to thrash and bounce around and solve the crisis, guns blazing. And we would like to be rescued. 90 minutes, Hollywood has an answer. This is amazing. Why can't sin be solved exactly like that? Wouldn't that be amazing? There's one little hitch to it. One small problem. You see that I like to see myself as the victim of this sin thing. I'm the one that got hurt by relationships, by people, by somebody that said something bad about me. I'm the one that's hurt, and I need to be rescued from this. I want justice for this. That's only one part of the coin, though. I'm perpetrator as well. I'm not only the one that's hurt, I'm the one that also hurts others. And if Jesus would have come to solve the sin problem, guns blazing, he would have taken me out. Because I'm part of the problem. And before you start pointing fingers at me, you're part of the problem too. We're all hurt by sin, and at the same time, we're the ones that do sin, that hurt and alienate each other. So who would Jesus have blasted if he would have come Hollywood style in the 1st century A.D.? Would he have done it to the Romans? Come in, guns blazing, the Romans? Yes, they had conquered foreign nations. The commanders, they had tortured people. Rebellions were squashed by lining thousands of crosses and killing people on crosses. A horrific death. Would they have deserved to die? Maybe. But what about the guy at the cross that says, this truly was the Son of God? Well, maybe it was the Pharisees that get such a bad reputation. Yeah, maybe, but what about Nicodemus? Blast him too? What about those that maybe the demonic people filled with demonic powers? Let's get rid of those. What about Peter? When Jesus says, Satan, get behind me, should he have just been blasted? Maybe the people that deserted Jesus, right? Then we wouldn't have any disciples left. Who should Jesus have blasted? And so maybe as we fathom this cross thing, maybe that's why it's so complicated, because we're part of the problem. And maybe that's why one part of the cross is, and this foolishness of the cross is because Jesus came to save us as well. So with that, the cross becomes this looming figure, this earth-changing event that God put there that we don't completely comprehend. This earth-changing event. The earth shakes, the heavens rip apart, and there's grace. The infinite God gives grace. Infinite grace for all of us. God comes to break the shackles of sin. So in this summary, in the last 2 verses of chapter 5, and we need this to jump into chapter 6, Paul says, where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. The bigger the sin problem is, the bigger the answer is. And that's an amazing thing, an infinite amount of grace. Chapter 6 begins with a question. I could almost imagine that the person reading this letter in early Sabbath morning worship had read 5 chapters. There's another 11 to go. Goes and takes a sip of water, and 2 guys in the back row are sitting there and contemplating this. And one guy says to the other one, this reminds me of the story of the woman that came and washed Jesus' feet at Simon the leper's house, right? And all the disciples look down upon her and say, well, what is she doing there? And this is crazy. What is she doing there, washing this loose woman? And Jesus tells the story of a man that got, two men that got their debt released. One of them had 2 years' wages and the other 2 months of wages. And Jesus asked the question, who loved more? The obvious answer is the one whose sins were forgiven more. So these two guys in the back are, well, if that's true, then the more I sin, the more I love Jesus. And the more I sin, the more grace I get. So let's go sinning like crazy. Rob a bank? Let's go. Break out of jail while we're at it? Let's just sin so that God's grace is more abundant. That's the question of chapter 6. Should we go and do this so grace may abound? And Paul seems to answer with 2 things. Number 1, you got yourself figured out wrong. And number 2, you got your fun figured out wrong. The first part is you got yourself figured out wrong. We like to think of sin in terms of consequences. The bigger the consequence, the bigger the sin, right? The more public it is, the bigger the public blunder is, the more we get to point fingers at somebody. I haven't killed anybody. I'm pretty good. I haven't committed adultery. I'm pretty good. We look at things in terms of effects, but God looks at it in terms of relationship. And God says anything that breaks relationship is equally sin. It's equally separation. It doesn't matter how big the effects are. Everything is the same. We look at ourselves and say, we're pretty good. We're all right. I go to church on Sabbath. God says, I see a completely different part to you. You've got yourself all figured out wrong. You are a slave to sin. You still hurt people. You still alienate people from yourselves. We are part of this problem. And the second part is that Paul would say to these people, you got sin figured out all wrong. It's not about having fun. Sin is a slave master that grabs a hold of you and doesn't let you go. Why would you want to stay with a slave master that beats you to death? If you can go free, why stick around? So here he proposes and says, I'm going to give you a solution. Chapter 6 is this amazing story of how we can respond to the cross. What should we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who die to sin still live in it? Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ were baptized into his death? We were buried with him in baptism by death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk into newness of life. This is all about newness of life. You want a new life? You want to have a good life, a worthwhile life? Live it with Jesus. That means going to face sin. Paul starts off and says 2 interesting things. First of all, you know better. You've gone through baptism, and we all know that sin is a problem. We look at the mirror of our soul, and we see the scars that have marred our life. We know that it's not pretty. We've looked behind the mask and seen what sin is like. Why do we want to stick around? You can try to drown out your sorrow or the issue of sin by indulging in it even more. You can try to beat it at its own game, or you can try to run away from it like Thoreau did. Or you can die to it and gain Jesus' freedom. Secondly, he says, Jesus is the one that has the answer. And indeed he does, because he's the only one that went through death and came on to the other side and lives to tell the tale of it. All our philosophers, all our scientists and poets, they're all dead. So all we have is their thoughts about what they think might be a good idea. Jesus is the one that has gone through it. And his solution is die to sin and have fullness of life. The symbol of baptism is this complete following. What it means to follow Jesus. Let me be clear, it's not easy. Dying is never easy, even if it's just figuratively in this case. Jesus has already died for us, so we just need to die to sin. It's just figuratively, and yet that's very hard. You know that the good things in life are often the hard things. That's why in college, getting a degree, working through the tests and exams and the work schedules. That's why you're rooming with somebody that snores at night or whatever your situation might be. Life isn't about being easy. And I didn't ask the question at the beginning, how do you have an easy life? I asked, how can you have a good life? Dying means suffering, means letting go of some things, making tough decisions, putting yourself in the background, fighting self, kicking habits. It's not easy for Jesus that had to go through death himself. This isn't an easy thing to ask, but it's the fulfilling life, the free life, the eternal life. I want to share 3 snippets as I was thinking about this of my personal life where I felt like I was really alive. I was baptized at the age of 17. Probably my parents were worried a bit because I waited quite a while. They might have asked themselves, did we raise him well enough? Does he know what he's doing? I waited. I wasn't quite sure about this Adventist thing. The Christian thing, okay, I wasn't quite sure about the Adventist thing. There was one other big problem, and that was Christian life in my home was very difficult to live. Not because of my parents, because I have a younger brother. And he was always a bit troubling, but he was going through a rough time in puberty, so life was very interesting at home. We fought on a daily basis about all things. He would start a fight I would never, of course, start a fight. At the drop of a hat, we'd get into quarrels, and he knew me better than anybody else. And he knew how to mess with me and get me going and push my buttons. And he did that well. He did that well, and we'd get into fights. I got baptized at the age of 17, and something strange and unexplainable happened. Something that I can't account for in any way. Because suddenly I had this peace about things. I didn't get into his ranting. I didn't let him push my buttons anymore. It seemed like I was almost floating on a cloud above his ramblings and above his prodding to get into the next fight. This unexplainable peace that I felt alive, not bound like a dog that gets red meat thrown in front of him, chasing into the next fight. I was free to make choices, free to see him in a different light as well, not just as a torturer of my soul, but a friend. The second moment that I recount was I told you about my graduation. I graduated from Southern, and I had a wonderful life. I had the degree, I had an old rusty car, and I had the girl. I didn't have the dog, but I had the degree. Both start with a D, so that's pretty much the same, right? That thing lasted about 3 days before the country song took its evil turn. I had great plans. I was going to propose. We'd been dating for 3 years. We'd known each other much longer than that. And then she got, without telling me, without having a fight or anything, she got into a plane and left. And that was it. And that hurt. That hurt. Pain makes you feel things. But it wasn't the pain that made me feel alive. It was what I made out of that pain. The only place that I felt safe to go to was my prayer closet. And that's where I felt alive. Not the pain of the situation, not the rejection. Alive, because I could go to somebody and share. And the comfort that I received in those moments alone with God, that was fulfilling life. The situation wasn't pretty, but those moments with God were. That rawness of faith, that trusting. The third story is a little harder to put into words. I started pastoring, and the first day of my job, I met the youth leader at the church that I was going to work at. And we started to work together. He was my age. We were both single. Both had a heart for youth ministry. And we worked together. We got to know each other as friends. And we'd spend many mornings during the week at a breakfast joint there. Most of the time, they had to kick us out by lunch, thinking about how we're going to do this for young people, how we're going to do that for ministry. And from there, it moved to, how are you doing in your life? And we had this friendship and developed this friendship of complete trust, openness, nothing sacred, nothing hidden, vulnerability and accountability, complete trust. And it didn't focus about the three things that usually guys talk about, which is women, beer, and football in non-particular order. This was about growing together as men of God and how to lead others. I felt alive. See, we can go to the mountaintop and feel God's presence and a worthwhile life. And we can go through the deep valleys of our life, and that both will happen. And if you're there at the moment, if you're there at the mountaintop, cherish those moments that you have with God. Relish it. Take those along as you continue your journey. Desert times will come and storms will come. Those memories will be your anchor. Maybe you're going through a valley. Then that is what you can take out of life, this relationship to God, this throwing yourself completely into His hands. And maybe for the many of us that aren't either on the mountaintop or the deep valley, that are just living life kind of in this rut, find a way of growing in Christ. That is worthwhile life. See, Jesus gives you the choice. You remember the story in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, you want to have praise from people because you pray openly? Go pray openly. Take the praise of people. God won't really care about it, but if you want that, take that. You want the fast lane in life, you can have it. God will not take that away from you. You can have it if that's what you want. But Jesus offers this other alternative, this meaningful, this rich, this full life, now and eternal life in the future. It's interesting to me that there are people, and you watch these video clips on YouTube, the GoPro kind of people that do these harrowing acts. The wingsuit jumpers, you've seen them. They wingsuit, they have just these flaps around their arms, and they jump off of these mountains at breathtaking speeds, inches above the ground, each one trying to just drop a little lower. The pictures are amazing. It used to be that if you're suicidal, you went skydiving. Then it was base jumping. Now it seems like it's wingsuiting or whatever they call it. And one thing I appreciate about them, their complete dedication to it, their commitment. There's nothing holding them back. Paul talks about, in this chapter, he becomes so personal and so raw that for the first time in the book, he will use 5 imperatives to address us personally. He says, submit yourself to God. Present yourselves. The Message Bible says, thrust yourselves fully into the hands of God. Only at the end of the book will he ever come to those imperatives again, at the conclusion of everything. The question in chapter 6 is, what are you going to do? Chapter 5 was all about what Jesus did. Chapter 6 is all about what you're going to do about the cross. You might be at different points in your life, but what are you going to do about that cross? The guys jumping out of planes and off of ledges in the mountains, they trust completely, give themselves fully. You don't jump out of a flying airplane and hold on to the airplane with one hand and pull the strap for the parachute in the other. That's going to end in disaster. And you're not going to attach a rope to the bottom of an airplane and say, let me experience from the safety of the airplane. If you want to experience, you got to jump completely and fully. And these guys do it, and they trust in a flimsy piece of nylon between them and death. What's keeping you back from thrusting yourselves completely into the hands of God? Are you alive? Are you really alive? Are you living a life with Christ?